I hope you have done your exercise in response to the 3 questions posed in video 1, and this video will offer you perhaps some further thoughts, theoretical thoughts, first on imagination, and at the end of this short introduction you will have a particular definition, one of probably many definitions of moral imagination. But I would like to start with another exercise. A simple test. Please listen to the 2 sentences I'm going to read now. Fingernails scratching the blackboard. The snake slithering on the grass while I'm having a picnic. Did these sentences provoke any reactions in you? Quite likely they did. Our minds are filled with pictures. There is a constant movement or traffic of images in them, whether we are awake or asleep. Human imagination, as we've already expressed, and you've already expressed in so many different ways through your engagement with the module in previous sessions, human imagination is an extraordinary thing, able to generate very powerful experiences and able to retrieve moving moments. Even if in reality nobody was scratching the blackboard with their fingernails, nor there was a snake on the grass next to us, some kind of experience have been generated. If I were to call evocative words such as peaceful, frightening, friend, enemy, love, joy, we would have a specific picture in mind, which most likely would relate to some experience or a person. So imagination can generate experience and is rooted in experience. Despite its existential evidence and significance, imagination has been largely ignored in theoretical moral reflection. In my area of ethics, this really is the case. It was often considered to be a faculty reserved for artists rather than serious academic thinkers, with a few exceptions mentioned throughout this module. Often confused with fantasy, and I do distinguish between imagination and fantasy, it had been variously treated by philosophers. In fact, there are some who would completely dismiss imagination as valuable for moral engagements. Rowan Williams, in his book Dostoevsky, Language, Faith and Fiction, says that no system of perceiving and receiving the world can fail to depend upon imagination. The capacity to see and speak into and out of a world that defies any final settlement as to how it shall be described. I'll read again the quote from Williams, especially what he means by imagination. He means the capacity to see and speak into and out of a world that defies any final settlement as to how it shall be described. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, in their book Metaphors We Live By, point out that in our daily life and academic engagements, we constantly think through pictures. We constantly use metaphors. For example, they suggest that in philosophy, we very often use war metaphors or violent metaphors. We say things like arguments can be won or can be lost. Argument is war. We say She attacked every weak point in my argument. Your claims are indefensible. I demolished her argument or his thinking. If you disagree, shoot. If you use that strategy, he will wipe you out, and etc. and etc. We constantly use language that is full of pictures. And I even suggest that perhaps we can try and imagine a culture where argument is not viewed in terms of fighting or war, but is viewed as a dance. The participants are seen as performers, and the goal is to perform in a balanced and aesthetically pleasing way. In such a culture, people would view arguments differently. That's their argument. They also talk about how we think about theories. Theories are often buildings. We use language of architecture when we talk about theoretical analysis. We talk about arguments as being shaky. We need some facts in order for the theory to stand or to be supported or not to fall apart. We think of ideas as food. What he said left a bad taste in my mouth. Sometimes ideas are half-baked or they smell fishy, and etc. and etc. So what exactly is imagination? And I know that you have your own definition by now, but let me bring some of the theoretical points here before we move to moral imagination. Neuroscientists tell us that imagination is closely linked to cognitive, emotional, and sensory activities. There is a very interesting study by Arnold Modell, Imagination and the Meaningful Brain. And Modell considers these activities, cognitive, emotional, and sensory activities, and attempts to explain how the brain turns sensory data into imagination. At its most basic level, imagination is the ability to form mental images of real or unreal phenomena or events, and to develop different scenarios or different perspectives on those phenomena and events. Philosophical inquiry into imagination is really complicated, and I wish I could tell you a lot about it, because I've done quite a bit of study in the past on philosophical notions of imagination. Not only are primary texts often imprecise and inconsistent, but secondary authors discussing the imagination in various primary authors of tradition are in radical disagreement sometimes concerning how the inquiry should be approached. For example, I have come across about 7 different studies of imagination in Immanuel Kant. Scholarship on this issue is divided as well as divisive. Depending on proclivities, scholars typically evaluate the uncertain status of the imagination according to literary, psychological, or philosophical perspectives, or any combination of thereof. Also, depending upon inclinations, scholars approach this issue from a conceptual or historical or phenomenological standpoint. Methodology is also at issue, whether to focus on a particular individual or represent the entirety of history, whether to pursue imagination conceptually, as I have done in my own work, or descriptively or phenomenologically. One further complication is whether one can look to a certain author or a group of authors and distill a theory of the imagination, or whether one attempts an inquiry more comprehensive in scope. Certain scholars prefer a fine-grained analysis of one or few primary authors. Others favor a global approach, writing topically on a great number of authors. The former represents deeper analysis while losing comprehensiveness. The latter group or the latter approach is all-inclusive while risking critical rigor and philosophical insight. So there is a lot to be considered when talking philosophically or theoretically about imagination. And in my view, all these inquiries can be put into three groups. Scholars who think that imagination is a superordinate faculty. It's a really something extraordinary, probably something superior to any other faculty. The second group are those who find the imagination as subordinate to other faculties. And the third group are those who find the imagination as a mediator between different faculties. The first of the three groups are those literary and philosophical masters that we find in the 19th century, for example, in the Romantic movement, particularly English Romanticism and German idealism. The authors sing hymns to the glory of the imagination. Literary figures like Coleridge, Keats, and Blake are examples here. The second group are those who denigrate the imagination and to some extent marginalize it as subordinate to all other processes involved in human experience. Plato actually is one example here. He criticizes the imagination because of its mimetic function. In the Republic, I think book 10, and in the handout you will have exact reference. He suggests that imitation is far removed from the truth. For him, imagination is the lowest form of human experience because of this imitative function. And then the third group, these are the scholars who see the imagination as a mediator between other powers of the mind. According to this view, imagination is neither the queen of the faculties, nor is it a mere slave or of higher, truer cognitive processes. It is integral to human experience. This third way argues for the imagination as the mediator between sense perception and reason or understanding. This route neither belittles nor exalts. Classically, thinkers such as Aristotle or Immanuel Kant, and many or perhaps most medieval thinkers attribute some mediational facility to the imagination. For Aristotle, for example, imagination was afforded a central role in how humans piece together their world. In the history of Western philosophy, up till Kant, many philosophers held that the imagination was a secondary movement following up perception. Its role was deemed to be essentially reproductive in the service of memory and reason. Authors sometimes worried that imagination is too subjective and cannot offer any objective claims. But others suggest that I don't have to live in ancient Greece in order to understand Homer or Sophocles, nor do I need to be a scholar of the Dutch Golden Age to realize the difference between Rembrandt and Rose paintings of Bathsheba with King David's letter, paintings that we will consider later in this session. In other words, the argument is that even if the imagination is a subjective faculty, it is possible to make universal claims. I put in universal in inverted commas because it is a really big statement. Because there are these different ambiguities and even disagreements in philosophical works on the studies of imagination, my own suggestion is to try to somehow narrow down the concept, or maybe talk about a particular type of imagination. And in my own field of ethics, I'm particularly interested in the concept of moral imagination. One of the philosophers that talks about moral imagination in detail is a British philosopher, Timothy Chappell, now Sophie Grace Chappell. In the book Knowing What to Do, Chappell says that in order to respond to the question, how are we to know what to do, we have to consider the moral imagination. And basically his book's answer is that by developing our moral imaginations, he talks about moral imagination in plural, we will be able to know the answer to the question what to do. The moral imagination for him, for her, being lots of things, has lots of different places in our deliberations and decisions. The moral imagination, in other words, is the polymorphous thing. To appeal to moral imagination for Chappell is to enter a plea for a more careful attention to and thought about the empirical detail of particular kinds of cases, or on behalf of open deliberation in preference to closed deliberation. Also, to appeal to the moral imagination can also be to stress the importance of an open-eyed willingness to engage with the reality of other people, to see them as other people, and indeed to rethink what it is to see anyone as a person. Scholars and writers such as Martha Nussbaum or Iris Murdoch give a lot of attention to imagination, sometimes speaking about the moral relevance of imagination, occasionally using the term moral imagination. And one can say a lot about these scholars, but I will move straight away to Mark Johnson, who offers, in my view, the most useful description of moral imagination. And I'm going to give you four points that he includes in his definition of moral imagination. They are the self-knowledge about imaginative structure of our moral understanding, including its values, limitations, and blind spots. The second element in the definition of moral imagination in Mark Johnson is a similar knowledge of other people. The third point is the ability to imagine how various scenarios and actions open to us might alter our self-identity, modify our commitments, change our relationships, and affect the lives of others. And the fourth element is the ability to imagine and to enact transformations in our moral thinking, our character, and our behavior. All these four elements are mentioned in the handouts, but it's worth thinking about them and spending some time maybe reflecting what these four elements really mean for us and whether we agree with this particular definition of moral imagination. And finally, I want to conclude this part of the lecture, or my reflection on imagination and moral imagination, with the moral significance of imagination. And this really relates to the question I asked you to consider: what are the powers of imagination? There are many, and I would like to suggest three powers that I think are relevant for our thinking for this session. So the first is the moving power of imagination. Basically, this is about recognition that images have a power to move us. They have power to connect with our desires, and contemporary image industry shapes our imagination and considers this power in a, I think, profound way and sometimes destructive way. Through visual images, we associate things with qualities. For example, currently we are marking Fair Trade Awareness Fortnight, and this campaign promotes fair wage for farmers, for food producers, clothes producers as well, in many parts of the world, especially the developing world. And the idea here is that images of this campaign can potentially inform the way we relate to shopping, or can help us to shape our shopping habits. Certain types of cars for some are associated with power, designer bags or designer shoes with certain type of lifestyle. Celebrities can be associated, or images they promote can be associated with certain way of life. If our imagination is predominantly filled with images that are promoting certain types of power, we may look at life through the prism of self-interest or external realities, or confirming or conforming to certain types of lifestyles, preoccupations with a certain type of body image, and etc. On the other hand, if our imagination is filled with images like the ones presented through a fair trade campaign, we probably would look at life through a prism of sharing or wealth creation or wealth distribution, and will think about benefits for all. In other words, our moral outlook is bound to be different if we see the world through images of sharing, or religious images of incarnation or cross. Images of cross can touch our inner self and challenge us to see goodness and flourishing in allowing ourselves to depend on God and God's grace. The second power of imagination that I want to highlight is the creative power. Imagination indeed has a creative power. It can create a picture which has a power to direct us towards a vision of the better self. In other words, imagination has a power of self-direction. Only when we imagine ourselves as being able to care better for others or for ourselves, being able to be more patient or more just or more kind or more temperate, especially at Lent time we want to consider this particular virtue. Only when we imagine ourselves as being those more able beings, we can really change. If we can't imagine ourselves as being able to be those things, probably the change is very difficult to enact. And the final power of imagination that I would like to consider is the interpretative role of imagination, and we will be doing or relating to that power quite a bit in this session. And it has to do with the way we see things. We see by means of imagination, not just only by taking a look, but also by interpreting and valuing what we see. This means that if, for example, I see my colleague at work as someone who spreads gossips, it is very likely that I will not share my confidential information with that person, because I will be immediately making interpretation that this person is likely not to keep the message to themselves. In doing so, I have already used or made use of interpretative power of imagination. Many, if not most, of our responses are governed by what we see going on and not by conscious rationalization of the situation. Again, to put this in the context of ethics or morality, although rules and norms may guide our responses, it is the images that help us see what we see and not see. And what we do see and what we don't see gives the direction of what we do. So, finally, to say that moral imagination uses all these three powers we have just considered. It is something that supplies the perspective on the moral situation. We often change our behavior when we see and try to experience life from a different point of view. And this view is often given to us by different images, whether they are verbal images or they are works of art, or they are images that we see in actual situations. As we said earlier, we think through pictures most of the time. Part of what we imagine is beyond our control. However, there is a possibility of allowing ourselves to choose the images we want to be part of our vision. And in many ways, to put it briefly, moral imagination is the kind of imagination that chooses to engage, chooses to look for what is not immediately visible. It's a kind of deliberate way of imagining. So I think these are the main points I wanted to share with you as part of this theoretical investigation. In the next video, I will suggest a very different type of engagement. It will be an engagement through a poem, and I look forward to sharing that with you. Thank you.